Susan Boyson is going to do a sort of an official welcome just now, but maybe if I can just give a couple of housekeeping rules for the Zoom meeting.
Connected to Sheila's iPhone.
So if you, anybody who's not speaking or presenting, if you could just keep your video and your microphone off so that we don't get any disturbance during the presentations. And for all the speakers, obviously when you come to present, you're welcome to turn your microphone obviously and your video on. We will have discussion Q&A at the end of the presentations, so please make a note of your questions and hold them until then. But you are also very welcome to use or make use of the chat function on the right hand side of your Zoom screen. So if you want to post any comments or brief questions in the chat section, then we'll do our best to collate those and include them in responses to questions and discussion at the end of the presentations. Okay, thanks very much. Professor Boyson, can I hand over to you briefly? Oh, there you go.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. All of our panelists in this discussion, visitors, colleagues. This webinar, Challenges Facing Basic Education in South Africa and the Impact of COVID, could not have been at a more crucial time where we face the realities, start facing the realities of the longer term impact, immediate and longer term impact of COVID. And in the field of basic education, which has already been a challenged field, I think it is a great time to take stock, and I really thank the panelists on behalf of MISTRA, Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Thank you very, very much. Heidi, my colleague Heidi Brooks, Senior Researcher in Humanity at MISTRA, will be introducing the panelists in detail very soon. Just on behalf of MISTRA, we thank you all. We've got an esteemed audience here from NGOs, government departments, national, provincial, big financial organizations, NGOs. We shall see more details of all of you and your identities when you participate in the discussion. Thank you very much to the participants. We look forward to the insights that you will be sharing with us. And most of all, even more than that, we look forward to having a vibrant discussion, drawing for a new insight, possible directions in this vexed field from all other participants. Thank you very much on behalf of MISTRA for accepting the invitations, for making yourself available for this discussion. I thank you very much. And then it is my pleasure to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Heidi Brooks, to introduce the speakers and a few points of direction on our deliberations this afternoon. Thank you. Over to you, Heidi.
Sorry, unmute myself. Thank you, Susan. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us and welcome. Just to provide, before I introduce the speakers, just to provide a little bit of context and background on this webinar today. In 2017, MISTRA launched a publication on reimagining basic education in South Africa, lessons from the Eastern Cape, which focused on governance, management, and accountability in the transformation of our education system. And so this event is something of a follow-up to that project, but it focuses more specifically on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on existing challenges in basic education for South Africa as a whole, not just for the Eastern Cape province. And obviously since March of this year, the pandemic has had profound social and economic impacts, both nationally and internationally, and it's particularly impacted the education of primary and high school learners through the closure of our learning institutions. And so as schools in South Africa are due to open in the coming week, this is particularly relevant, but of course they've already experienced some temporary reopening prior to the government's first directive to close schools during the peak of the virus. So throughout this period, the interconnection of the pandemic and government's response has raised important debates for parents, learners, teachers, families, the state and civil society around safety protocols for schools and the readiness and support needed to implement these, inequality and differentiation between public and independent schools, the right to education during the pandemic, but also the responsibility of the state and educational institutions to provide for the safety of learners and teachers. Pedagogical disruption for learners in all grades, but particularly in key transitional and assessment years, issues of contact versus online instruction, and the implications of this for under-resourced schools and learners who face challenges accessing online facilities. And of course, challenges to the very correctness of the government's response to the pandemic, and of course, solutions to for transforming basic education beyond COVID-19. And so our presentations today touch on several of these themes, and so we hope for a really fruitful discussion. As I said earlier, if you can keep your questions to the end, or you're very welcome to use the chat function on Zoom to post any questions or comments, and we'll try our best to collate those and cover them in the discussion at the end. So let me just introduce our speakers. Firstly, we have apologies from Professor Nikki Roberts due to family and personal circumstances and an emergency. She can't be with us. But we have today Dr. Logan Govender, who is Senior Lecturer at the Ali Musrai Center for Higher Education Studies at the University of Johannesburg. And he's an education policy and development specialist. We have Dr. Linda Wichuma, who is a teaching and learning advisor at Wits University and also research fellow in curriculum studies at the University of Stellenbosch. And we have Dr. Michael Gastro, who is chief research specialist in education and skills development at the HSRC. So just to echo Susan's thanks, welcome to all of our speakers. And we look forward to some really nice presentations. Dr. Govender, perhaps I can first hand over to you to share your screen. Dr. Govender is presenting on COVID-19 and the return or not to school, teacher unions and the state in management of the pandemic.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me.
We can.
I'm just trying to see if I can get the screen share to work here.
If not, we can also share from the side.
Yeah, I seem to be having some problems getting to the screen share.
Okay. Norma, do you want to share your screen for Logan's presentation?
Okay, I'll do it just now.
Thanks, Norma.
Okay, I think I'm able to share the screen now. There, I'm able to share my screen.
Okay, you can go
All right,
ahead.
is that okay? So I'll just go ahead.
Sure.
My apologies for that delay. So yes, the full slides on. I hope you can see them. And I think maybe just to pick up from Heidi, when she referred to the Eastern Cape book project that MISTRA had launched towards the end of 2017, I was actually part of that project, and I was co-editor of the book publication. So it's a real pleasure once again to be invited to an event hosted by MISTRA. So thank you very much for that. And as you can see, my topic today is on the COVID-19 return to schools, teacher unions and the state in the management of the pandemic. What I'd like to say before I get into the presentation itself, since working on the book publication with MISTRA, well, at the time I was working for Save the Children South Africa. And one of the things that I really got to appreciate then was the importance of ECD, that's early childhood development, to the rest of the education system. And now, since last year, I've been at the Ali Mazrui Center for Higher Education Studies at UJ, where I've been working mainly on issues of higher education research, issues around student epistemic access and success, and issues around the decolonization of the curriculum. And I mention all of this because it's relevant to some of the points I'm going to be making during my presentation. Of course, I still maintain a huge interest in basic education, which is the sector I really come from, especially issues relating to teacher unionism and teacher professionalism. So just a brief outline of the presentation. Following on a short introduction, I'll provide some context of what I'm going to be talking about, and then look at the impact of the coronavirus on the education sector, especially the schooling sector, and how come this has been the way it has turned out to be. And then what should unions and the state actually be doing to address some of the challenges? And then I'll go to some conclusion. So then, just by way of introduction, I mean, there's no doubt that, the pandemic has, appearing so suddenly has taken the world by surprise. And teacher unions and the state and our own country is no exception. But what's very interesting is that with teacher unions and the state, and yeah, we're talking largely about, the education organs of the state, which I'll be referring to, as in times of crises, they tend to resort to narrow self-interests. Fortunately, though, over the recent months, there has been a growing realization that education is in fact a broad collective interest. And that is, a broader societal interest. That teachers' lives matter as much as learners' lives matter, and everyone else's lives. And significantly, the pandemic has presented us, and this I think is really important, with a much bigger challenge about how do we go about reconfiguring the provision of education in the short to medium term. So just in terms of some broad context, I'm going to just draw on some quotations, and the first one relates to teacher union state relations. It's a quotation by Basquiat and Osmond, which I've referenced at the bottom of the slide, where they suggest that unions in many countries focus their energies on influencing policy development. And when they are able to strike some kind of a good partnership with government, they then strive to maintain these relationships with advocacy work on the part of their members. Now, this is really critical in teacher union relations because the role of unions in education is really about balancing their members' interests with the broader public interests. And I think we see this, playing out very much during the pandemic. Now, the second quotation by way of context that I want to refer to, and here I draw on the work of another colleague, Pam Christie, from UCT, who recently published a book and had a book launch just last month on decolonizing schools in South Africa, the impossible dream. And of course, that's a big question. Some might suggest, it's no question at all. It's something that has to happen. But anyway, I'm just drawing on one of the quotes from a presentation where she suggests that, the assumption that all public schools, and you can read this quote, you can see what she's suggesting, is that the divided school system, that's a legacy of the last 20 odd years post 94, is not really the solution to South Africa's education problems. And that it distracts from the important tasks of rebuilding our schooling system at the moment of decolonial change. And I've highlighted that because I really do think that the context of decolonizing education is really important as we think about how we tackle some of the challenges that the pandemic has so sharply spotlighted for us. So while I agree largely with Pam Christie's assessment, I do think that there have been important recent developments in the country that are worth noting, especially in relation to teacher unions and the state. And I've noted some of these on this slide. The first one, the campaign to hold government accountable, regarding the minimum norms and standards of schools infrastructure, led by the NGO Equal Education, really significant. But of course, it was noticeable that teacher unions didn't really provide much leadership in this regard. But of course, they have been active elsewhere, especially around the Teacher Union Collaboration Initiative in relation to the professional development of teachers. This is an initiative with government, the National Education and Collaboration Trust theme on teacher professionalization and other projects. And then the Education Labor Relation Council's, the ELRC's policy initiative for the integration of grade R into the foundation phase, which I believe is a really significant policy change highlighting the importance of ECD. Now, all this is happening, and what do we have? We suddenly have to deal with the various challenges that we face, and then we are faced with this global pandemic, the coronavirus. And so what have we seen over the last 5 months? And this is the real impact. We've seen a return to old style teacher union state relations, government and unions at odds with each other, the resurfacing of unilateral decision making, teacher union state face-offs in the media, even policy analysts squaring up against each other. My colleagues Nick Spall making the case of return to school given the data suggesting children are less likely to be infected. I'm not sure this is entirely the case. And then Jonathan Jansen, who has argued in some of his inputs and analyses that the loss of one school calendar year is no big deal. So the opinion is quite divided. How come? Clearly, we've been caught off guard. We've forgotten that inclusive decision-making is better than narrow, self-serving decisions. And really important is the persistent social and economic inequalities in our society that has seen largely privileged children benefiting with ongoing classes that they are able to access online, while the majority of our learners are really struggling. So I think two different views have actually surfaced. And this is captured very well by my colleagues Aslam Fattar and Azim Badruddin, who wrote recently in the South African Review of Education, the special issue journal that came out last month, on the one view suggesting that what we are dealing with is the dominant power hierarchies and interest groups that see the return of learners to school as maintaining the narrative of schooling inequality. Well, I'm not so sure that the state, government, teacher unions, and other stakeholders are really concerned or want to maintain this narrative of inequality, although probably that's what the outcome is, given their pursuit of narrow self-interest. The other view sees the reorganization of current education provision as an important opportunity to shift the discourse somewhat so that we are really able to look at our education system in new and innovative ways so that we can address the inefficiencies and challenges that we have experienced over the past 20 odd years. So given that, what should teacher unions and the state be doing? So here are some short to medium term suggestions. Firstly, the first one really, all hands on deck is, I would say from my own work experience and having worked, I've just got a message saying my internet connection is unstable, so I hope I don't get shot out of this connection, but let me just push on. From my own work experience, I think it's really worth looking at establishing a COVID-19 education work stream, as we have done in the ELRC in terms of other issues. But I think the one big challenge there is that the ELRC work streams are really confined mainly to unions and the government. And it would really need to expand its composition to include parents and other stakeholders if it's really going to be relevant and appropriate. But then the National Education Policy Act of 1996 makes provision for a broader education and training forum. And this inclusive education stakeholder forum, believe it or not, hasn't seen the light of day, but it's provided for in legislation. Thirdly, and I think there's been a lot of discussion around this, the provision of data to support poor families, communities, and so on. The universities have done a pretty good job, I think, with regard to this, to support students. But here's the big question. Why has there been no such effort for school-based learners in this regard? Fourthly, I think we should think about a module for online distance teaching skills for all teachers, both in service and pre-service, to deal with the complex and diverse needs of our learners. In terms of the medium to long term, there are three suggestions that I would like us to consider. And the one is clearly, we should be looking at our education provision as something that goes beyond the school, given its limits as an institution, to respond to the kind of challenges we are going to be faced going forward, in the face of pandemics and other crises that may be related to climate change and other natural disasters and so on. And secondly, I draw on Pam Christie's book, where she speaks about an all-world ethics of how we might live together with all others and the earth we share. And what's really interesting about what she's referring to here is sharing beyond just and with nature. So you can see where she's coming from, because if you think about the origins of COVID-19, you can see the relevance of what she's talking about. And then, of course, I draw on the work of the third suggestion for us to think about in the medium to long term, is the work of a colleague from the University of Coimbra in Portugal, Professor Boaventura Santos, who we were fortunate to host last year. And he delivered a series of lectures on alternative epistemologies. And what is really relevant for the discussion and the points I am arguing for is his notion of the epistemologies of the South that privileges ancestral knowledge and other popular forms of knowledge. So, keeping all of that in mind, if one thinks about returning, on the question of returning to school, my suggestion here is quite a simple one. We just have to follow the virus. If infections are high, then no ways. When the pandemic retreats and schools are prepared, to have students and teachers and keep them safe, of course. And in the long term, as I've suggested, plan for multi-site education using various platforms. So just by way of conclusion, I would like to suggest that what we really need to be doing at this time, not just teacher unions and government, but all of us, is to have a more caring and activist approach to how we live, learn, and relate to each other as human beings. Teacher unions in the state to reset the parameters of the relationship, to focus on the broader collective interests of society. Of course, education provision, we all know, is the business of all key stakeholders. I think we need to see more interdepartmental collaboration. And strangely enough, we haven't seen a lot of this in recent months. And finally, I think, and this is really important, I think, we must revisit the notion of education as a lifelong activity, as many of our learners will continue to fall behind, given the inequities and inequalities in the system. So with those few thoughts, I thank you, and I hope it stimulates some questions and suggestions from your side. So I look forward to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Logan. Noma, could you share Dr. Chuma's presentation, please? Noma, are you able to share your screen for the second presentation? Noma, can you hear us? Dr. Chuma, can you hear me? Spagazi, thank you. Great. Thank you. Dr. Chuma, are you ready to feel free to begin when you're ready.
Okay, you can speak now. on the phone?
Yeah, speak on the phone.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our talk this afternoon is going to be on the impact of COVID-19 on language transition and development, and specifically focusing on interruptions and possibilities for grade 4 learners of 2020. Next slide. In our brief discussion, we're going to talk about the language policy in education. We're going to look at the interim strategies that have been put in place by DBE to manage the emergency remote learning. And we're also going to, in conclusion, look at the preparation for the recovery period when schools reopen. I posit that the experience of COVID-19 is a critical moment in learning. Why do I say so? Because it has been transformative. Giordano 2003 highlights some characteristics of critical moments in learning, and I've just picked a few. Such moments are rare, they are difficult to predict, and they are very significant to the learner. Well, it takes time for the learner to realize their significance. And in most cases, it also takes time for teachers to acknowledge or to realize the occurrence of these moments. And my own emphasis here is that it's not only teachers who take time to realize these moments, it's curriculum developers, policy planners, and other stakeholders in education. Now, to fully understand the disruptions that COVID-19 has placed upon us, we're going to look at the South African language in education policy. The language policy stipulates that English and Afrikaans are used as languages of learning and teaching in the upper primary level, which is the intermediate phase, after having used mother tongue instruction in the lower levels at foundation phase. This makes grade 4 a significant transition year in the SA schooling system. With grade 4 being a significant year, it means that at grade 4 level, the language of learning and teaching changes. And there is evidence that with the stipulation of using English and Afrikaans, 90% of the learners actually use English. In as much as we can use either Afrikaans or English, 90% of the learners opt to use English because that's the language that they can at least relate to. Now, these particular learners, we call them English language learners because they are learning the language, and at the same time, they're going to be using that language which they are learning to take part in the rest of the learning activities. These learners also are multilingual. Now, if you're learning a language for the purposes of using it to access the curriculum, you've got to be proficient in the language, because proficiency in that language improves performance across the curriculum. And if you're not proficient in the language, there are going to be consequences in the transition as well as in the rest of the phase levels that follow afterwards. To better amplify the realities of language in education, let us look at two types of learners at grade 4 level. Right. The first learner is the one who's found in a resource area. This learner, right from the beginning of foundation phase, uses English or Afrikaans. When they get to grade 4, nothing much happens. They might have extra subjects added and all the other changes that come with the grade 4 transition. But regarding language, there is not much of a difference. They're just continuing with the English and Afrikaans as stipulated by the language policy. Now, we've got a second learner. This is the learner that we spoke about earlier, who's part of the 90% that is using English from grade 4 level. This learner is multilingual. This learner is, in most cases, is coming from an under-resourced area. This learner is also under-digitalized. And this learner does not have many opportunities many educational opportunities beyond the classroom. This is the type of learner that our discussion is focused on today. We have to credit the DBE for the strategies that they've put in place to help us manage the remote learning. There's use of radio and television to disseminate online content. There's use of live streaming. There's access that has increased towards digital resources and online content. And various platforms have been used to disseminate the information to help people know how to access the information. And DBE has also been inclusive in these strategies. There are measures in place to provide for learners who are hard of hearing. There are measures in place to provide for learners who are in special schools. And the mere fact of using the public broadcaster means the information can be accessed by different communities. Also, some of the information is rated, and it is cost effective to access it. However, there is a gray area when it comes to provision for learners who are English language learners who are changing from mother tongue education to using English. This may mean that the needs of the under-digitalized and under-resourced learner are not properly addressed. Why are we specifically focusing on grade 4s? What is so peculiar about them? First of all, we assume that they are not vulnerable enough. And for that reason, we don't usually prioritize them, yet they are highly at risk. We'll use the example of the revised curriculum, the revised school calendar that we have as of the 7th of August 2020. According to this calendar, our exam classes have only lost 25% of their school days. Below that, we've got ECD and grade 10 and 11, who've lost 41%. The worst affected is the cluster of grade 4s, 5, 8, and 9, who've lost more than half of their school days. I would like to separate the grade 4s out of this cluster that they've been put in, because in the first 9 weeks of the school year, while they were still in class, these learners received, we assume, they received some guidance on using English as language of learning and teaching. That was before the school closures. And ordinarily, this guidance will be informed by specific strategies which are used by teachers, which include code mixing, code switching, pedagogical translanguaging. There's a lot of them. So they would ordinarily have received this. Now, this role of a transition into using English as language of learning and teaching has been transferred to caregivers, to parents. However, these people that we are giving the role now, these people are now assuming this responsibility, may have limited education and resources to actually facilitate the transition, let alone facilitating the transition during some remote period of learning. There are stages in language acquisition, and an English language learner who's learning a new language passes through different stages. There are 5 key stages. There could be more, but 5 key ones. The first 3 lay the foundation for acquiring a language. There's receptive stage, production stage, imagery stage. It's about laying the foundation. It's about learning the language. The last 2 stages are for using the language that has been learned to access academic content. In these last 2 stages, that's when we expect learners to be reading at grade level. That's when we expect them to be composing organized essays. Amidst this, there's evidence that by grade 3 level, learners from our under-resourced schools are actually 2.5 years behind the curriculum. Now, if we're looking at the phases that we have, the stages, by stage 3, there should be a speech emergence stage. But if there are 2.5 years, that takes us back to maybe even beyond the receptive stage. And if that is the case at grade 3 level, the same applies to grade 4 level, because nothing much is going to change within a space of a few months. Furthermore, 78% of our grade 4 learners cannot read for meaning in any language. There's evidence leading to that. And if this is the case, if our learners cannot read for meaning, it also means that they cannot access the content that they are supposed to be accessing. And this becomes a big problem. It is important for the English language learners to reach stages 4 and 5 by the time they are in grade 4. But according to the evidence that we have, they are far from reaching there. Therefore, we've got a big problem. Let me share with you an integrated model of literacy development, which incorporates both the home factors and the school factors. In this emergent remote learning period that we're in, we expect teachers to then use the school factors to produce the content which is going to be passed on to the people who are now responsible for the transition of language development, and whatever content that they produce should then be suitable to be used by people who've got limited resources and using it within a certain environment, the home, which maybe could be under-digitalized. And according to this model as well, we need to understand that language development should actually start in preschool. Then it moves on to a formal classroom where there are certain conditions to be met if it is going to be done successfully. These conditions include the language transition or the literacy development being managed by knowledgeable teachers, competent teachers. Learners need to be provided with opportunities to read, and they must want to read. We need to make them want to read so that they can develop their reading skills. There should also be access to reading material as well as a balanced instruction. This then leads to literacy development. If we satisfy these needs which are needed, it then leads us to literacy development, which can then fit into academic performance. There are a collection of skills, moving from the most basic ones to the very complicated ones. There's a list of skills that we need to consider when we are developing literacy in our English language learners. I'm not going to go through all of them because of time, but they start from deriving a meaning, they go on to grammar elements until we get to points where our learners can actually read a text with understanding and be able to summarize it. However, we've just realized that we've lost at grade 4 level more than 50% of the time that we have to actually conduct these lessons. What is therefore needed is that instead of looking at the whole list, the whole menu that contains all the literary skills that we should be focusing on, based on the limited time that we have, we need to pick the core skills that will build the foundation that we spoke about earlier. We do not have the time to go through everything, but what we can do is to pick the core, the basics that will help to lay the foundation so that when you get back in 2021, at least we've got something to build up on, and then we can move on with the language development and literacy development. And one important thing also is that these core skills, the spellings, the reading of words, meaning making, and reading storybooks, we should try to make sure that they are not too dependent on technology. In as much as we've said we're using the public broadcaster, we're trying to reach all communities, but there is no clear evidence that each and every learner in an underdeveloped area is able to access all that information that is put across there. Therefore, whatever that we're doing, we should try to make sure that these basic skills can be, we can go through them without relying too much on technology. We've just realized that our grade 4s are at risk, there's no doubt about that. And our role is to narrow the gap, narrow the language proficiency gap between those learners that we call the English language learners and the English first language speakers. Now, The first thing that we have to do is to make COVID-19 or the experiences of COVID-19 on education an opportunity for language development instead of just an interruption to it. If we're to relate back to the previous slide that we've just gone through, one of the things that we could do is to make sure that whatever we're doing, it is strategic. Whatever language development activities are offering to the learners, they are strategic, and we know that we can use them when the learners come back. And we need to target specific language development support, which should be specifically for the English language. They do not need to struggle more than they currently are doing, because we realize that they are behind. They do not always get the resources that are meant for them. Therefore, we need to try to make learning a language for the purpose of using language to access the rest of the information as manageable as possible. We need to look at our teacher resources. We've got resources that we can harness, and if there are learners maybe in resourced communities who do not necessarily need the assistance with the transition, then we might reassign those teachers maybe to take care of the learners that we know they need it the most. There is expertise that we have around us. We've got language experts, we've got language development practitioners, we've got lead teachers in languages, and we need to pull those together and make sure that we channel them to where they are needed currently. Even if we're using the radio and television broadcast, if we have lead teachers specifically in language development responsible for the development of literacies in English language learners, it's going to be much better. There are best practices from other countries. We do not have to take them exactly the way that they are. We can adapt them, we can adopt them to suit our own environment. For instance, in Poland, there is a call to support the lead teachers who are responsible for remote learning. We could also try that. In Netherlands, there's use of music to teach language remotely. And in Colorado, we've got teachers developing toolkits which simulate what would have taken place in class, and these are shared with parents and caregivers so that they can use them with the learners at home, since it is their responsibility now to educate the learners. Inequalities have always been there. We've always had inequalities in education. COVID-19 has done is to magnify them. Our role is to narrow the gap, as we said earlier. What the experience of COVID-19 has also taught us is that we are not ready for emergencies. We are not ready for disasters in education. Therefore, it is critical for us to have plans in place, plans specifically targeting such disasters, and we also invest in the planning. The measures that we have seem to be on the reactionary side. We are reacting to a situation that is here. What we could possibly do is to plan in advance, have early warning systems and functional ones for that matter, have some strategic monitoring and evaluation of the system so that we know how to manage disruptions in education. Because it would be very presumptuous of us to think that COVID-19 is the only disaster that we are going to have to go through. It will be easier if we have systems in place to manage this kind of disasters. We also need to invest and also use both high-tech and low-tech systems which will support both under-digitalized and digitalized communities. Once we develop these, there can always be a backup plan that we can fall back onto should we need them in future. There is also a need to develop proficiency in the use of technological remote learning for our teachers as well, our school management teams. The more proficient they are, the better delivery of the content.
Can I ask you to wrap up, Lindiwe, please, at the interest of time?
COVID-19, or the experiences of COVID-19, was a critical moment in learning. We did not expect it. The return of the learners back to school, we do expect it. We're looking forward to it. We've lost so much time. And therefore, it is not going to be a critical moment in learning. What are we currently doing to plan for that time when the learners return to school? what strategic plans do we have in place to cater for other digitalized grade 4 learners? How is their interrupted language transition going to be reconciled? And currently, how are we developing our teachers to prepare them to manage the return of the learners back to school? Are we going to wait for the matric results of 2028 to determine the effects of COVID-19 on language development or the lack thereof? That's the question that we need to be looking at the present moment. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks very much, Dr. Chuma. I know you're having problems with the sound on your computer, so thanks for taking us so clearly through that. Okay, then on to our third and final speaker, Dr. Michael Gastro. If you want to, yeah, great, you're all ready to go. Welcome, please go ahead.
Hi everyone, and thanks to MISTRA and the organizers for the opportunity to engage here today. It's an interesting topic, and as has been mentioned, it is on point for what is really relevant and significant at this juncture. So I'm glad to be here. The overall argument that I'm going to make has two parts that are related. The first is that COVID has acted as a catalyst for technological change that was already taking place with a focus in this situation on digitalization. It has accelerated some of these processes. And another part of my argument is that within the context of digitalization and education, COVID raises new challenges and makes existing challenges more urgent. And those are some of the points I'm going to touch on. My main focus is essentially on the technological aspect of education, what this means in the post-COVID world, and what are the normative and the practical issues that we can think about. My point of departure, like the other speakers, is that education in South Africa is fractured and unequal, and access to quality education still depends on who you are, where you were born, what race you are, where you live, whether you're middle class or poor. And we're all aware of this, the divisions. It creates a school system for the privileged that's privatized, technologically developed, digitally connected, and a system for the marginalized that's underfunded, technologically underdeveloped, and disconnected from the digital world. This is a very deep digital divide that is going to have implications for generations to come. This we already know. These systems produce unequal outcomes in terms of literacy, numeracy, preparedness for post-school education, and participation in labor markets. And these unequal outcomes in turn reinforce the social and economic inequality that we've been grappling with for a long time. So when thinking about education and digitalization in South Africa, for me, it's a question of social justice and historical redress, as well as a question of economic growth and competitiveness, and we need to weigh up these different priorities. So when you think about the dynamics of digitalization and technological change in the world of education and skills development, we want to start off with some principles. What are our guiding stars here? For me, the first principle, especially in COVID, where the digital access is increasingly significant, that we must use digital tools to narrow the digital divide. And it must be so, particularly for Black South Africans. We can't avoid a race lens on this issue. Black South Africans are proportionally way more disconnected and on the disconnected side of the digital divide. And as learners move into the post-school system or into work, digitalization has the potential to create new kinds of opportunities for Black participation in both the formal and informal economies, and I think that should be a priority for us. Then another principle, which is closely related, is the issue of inequality and digitalization. I think we must aim to leverage it to reduce inequality. Left uncontained and unregulated, my view is that it will have the opposite effect. So we must at least aim or desire to reduce structural inequality. I mean, one of the things that's really tragic in this country is that the poor face vastly higher data costs per megabyte than the middle class. So if you buy data in small 10 meg bundles or something, those 10 megs cost a tiny fraction, maybe 1 or 2 or 10% of what you pay for that megabyte if you're middle class and you've got a contract. So these are issues that pertain to education because children live in families. It's about expanding internet access, working towards data justice. These are critical underpinnings. And I'll get to, I mean, we can start to imagine already what this means for COVID. And in a broader context, approaches to education also need to think about other kinds of technological change, industrial automation, services automation. These things have the potential to exclude unskilled and low-skilled workers from formal employment while benefiting the highly skilled and the holders of capital. And I think this needs to come into play when we think about education in COVID too. So, I mean, before I go into more detail about what to do about these priorities, I think it's really important to listen to the voices of young people on these issues. And there have been surveys that can help us do this globally and in South Africa. And it's clear from this kind of research that the digital capabilities are significantly higher amongst the middle class, and they've got greater access. And amongst all demographics, there's a greater importance placed within the minds of young people. Firstly, the need to develop their digital skills, but also to develop their human or soft cognitive skills, because machines in many cases will replace the current roles that people have that are easily replicable. What's interesting is that young people are largely positive about engaging in continuous learning and having flexible skill sets. So in a global survey, 80% of youth respondents believe that they're going to continuously learn throughout their careers. You need to reconceptualize what education then means. It's not the first 12 years or first 15 years. Also, a large proportion, majority of youth believe that digital tools will become increasingly important for self-learning. So more than 70% of respondents of youth in South Africa and other countries believed they could teach themselves anything they wanted using freely available online sources. So this is kind of, so there's a sense of freedom, educational freedom, against the backdrop of reservations, because 40% of respondents believe that their job is, in future might be replaced by a robot or an AI system. So there's this kind of a tension between reservations and optimism amongst the youth. So when thinking about what this means, and I'll apply to COVID shortly, just on the digitalization side, there's some things that we can draw from this. I mean, the first is that digitalization, because it's accelerating so fast, because computing power and software and tools and systems change so fast, and other related technologies change fast, whether you're talking about 3D printing or robotics or skills and tech domains that are cognate with digitalization. They change so fast that the shelf life of skill sets becomes quite short. So the rational way to respond to that is to shorten curriculum cycles in a way that responds to technological change. In other words, school curricula should prepare learners for future study by being responsive to what these changes are. And in South Africa, there has been this kind of response. The Department of Basic Education is experimenting with the introduction of coding in schools, for example. This is an important feasibility study step to see what the enablers and constraints and challenges are. That's a huge undertaking. And one thing we must really remember, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's not only about connecting people, developing digital skills, it's about preparing humans to compete with machines in a labor market where machines are going to increasingly take on machine-like tasks. So skills like memorization and repetition then in principle will become less important, and skills like creativity and empathy and innovation and working in teams and social skills and managing complexity, the things that machines are not that good at doing, need a greater focus. And then the other issue, also increasingly relevant for COVID, is that you have different pedagogical modalities. So if you're digital, there's a fundamental shift away from person-to-person skills transfer into a mixture between person-to-person and digitally mediated skills transfer. So those of us who have children will know what COVID has done to this space. It has put us in a spin. And there's this need and sense of urgency at schools, at universities, other sites of education to have a sudden and large-scale shift towards online learning modalities. And this is a seismic event. The educational institutions have very rapidly established online learning systems that have made it possible to continue education despite the closure of physical sites. But this really brings into very sharp relief the flexibility and the potential of online learning, because suddenly it's been forced into a situation where we must demonstrate that this is possible. It also shows us that structured and formalized online learning could lead to improved educational outcomes in a time of crisis. And that's really something to think about. It also means that there's new kinds of skills that become increasingly important. For example, it becomes really critical to be able to navigate interactive teaching and learning platforms. If your school is closed, if you can't go for some reason, and this may play out over the next 6 months or year or 18 months, we don't know, you need to be able to navigate these platforms. If you're a learner and you don't have the skills necessary to get onto Zoom and speak to your class or go online on your school system and draw down your lessons and put your feedback in, then there's a problem. Another related one is it's important to be able to navigate online knowledge resources to find and use new knowledge in a goal-directed and constructive manner. And that's a very different thing to just browsing Wikipedia and randomly getting information. And now that there's a greater proportion of time spent out of schools, this becomes critical. Another one is the kind of issues of standards and generalization. So at the moment, and I think there's still research on this is still going on, and I'll welcome the group here to add extra information if people know more, is that the response is fragmented, but it may be the case that nationally applicable standards and tools and content and curricula for online learning would be of great value at this time. There's different schools, different types of schools, different parts of the system are generating their own online systems and responses. And creating these kinds of national platforms and structures, I think, would continue to hold significant value after the pandemic. When physical sites are open again, you still got this digital platform if someone is excluded for whatever reason that they can use. So in general, I think what's really been brought to the fore, the catalyst for change, is that the interplay between the physical and the digital worlds in education has suddenly become much more significant than it even was. It was already important. And now it's really critical. And ultimately, what we've been talking about now, debates, do schools open, do we use a year, do we not? The continuation of education now depends on digital solutions. I mean, there's children back at school, but my own children, if there's one case of COVID, that school will close for 2 weeks and then everyone's back online. One needs to be prepared for that. Then there's the question of technological capabilities of education institutions. And this is at the heart of the digital divide in the education system. And it's not about connecting more schools to the internet. That's a kind of first step, necessary but not sufficient condition. This needs to happen in tandem with the development of capabilities for using the digital technologies in education. So once you've got an internet connection, maybe you've got some hardware, you've got some software, there needs to be the capability to use that in a sustainable way. So one kind of policy issue that's raised is infrastructure development, increasing connectivity, but there needs to be this kind of capability development. I think, if you spend a lot of time working in the education sector, you will have seen empty labs gathering dust. It's a sad sight, and it's not necessarily something that has to be that way. Then just turning briefly to what the institutions in South Africa have been doing, you know, there's been critique, and there always is, and some of it's valid and some of it's not, but there has been movement in ways that's positive, I think. You know, and the DBE is reviewing its curriculum to incorporate more digital skills. They're looking at robotics and coding. UNISA is involved with the DBE, lending them their labs. There's quite a lot of devolved action at the provincial level. The CETAs are working on digital skills with provincial governments. So there is quite a lot going on. And it's, you know, we need to look at the capabilities of the system for affecting those kinds of changes. And it's in other departments as well. The Department of Communication and Digital Technologies has an ICT policy white paper, with a big focus on digital skills. And I think one of the other speakers mentioned it. We have to get these departments to speak to each other. I mean, it gets kind of crazy sometimes. They'll, you know, be talking about the same thing in buildings next door to each other, but there's no like phone line between those buildings. So those are my observations about the digital world and COVID. Just to pull out my main points, I think the number one thing we need to think about when guiding the analysis and the policy recommendations is the issue of inequality. I think the digital divide is one of the most serious issues facing this country, and it separates learners who have access to the entire knowledge resources of the internet from those that just don't. And that's an untenable situation. This is a very long-term impact on our country. And I think, you know, at this point in time, when children need internet access to get an education, data justice is a life and death thing. And it's not just political kind of hamstringing that happens with the allocation of spectrum. I think the big ICT actors in this country are essentially oligopolistic. They are price gouging the poor. It's you know, it's a crime against this country. And I wish the Competition Commission would take a bigger bite out of them. You know, this is about the future of our children. It shouldn't be about corporate profit for giant firms. And of course, the issue of gender is always on the table. My colleagues do more work on this than I do, but you know, the evidence makes it 100% clear that girls are proportionally disadvantaged and on the wrong side of the digital divide, and have a low level of access to digital skills development. And it's absolutely critical that that is also addressed. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Dr. Gastro. So we've had 3 really interesting presentations. I'm going to open it up now to questions from the floor. So feel free to use the raise hand function, and I can look for people who want to ask a particular question. Maybe we can take sort of 3 or so questions and then go over to the presenters to respond. Perhaps I can start with a couple of points just raised on the group chat during the presentations that maybe presenters would like to respond to. So one, in relation to the role of the unions, and I don't know whether Dr. Govender, you'd like to comment on some of the role that the unions have played in terms of liaising with the Department of Basic Education and with school governing bodies. And so some of the joint work that has been taking place during the pandemic to try and bring resolutions and also to get schools ready for teaching. So that's one of the points that also relates to an issue raised again in the chat, that in South Africa, and unlike in some other states, the unions do have a good relationship with the government. They do have a working relationship, and so perhaps we can maximize that. So perhaps you'd like to respond to that. And then the other issue around the digital divide is ways in which we can facilitate non-contact learning that doesn't necessarily rely on digital technology. So there's a question here about, for example, access to television and radio, and whether that is a good forum, a good means or vehicle by which students can access learning resources that is far more widespread and crosses the class divide. So there's a couple of questions there. I don't see any hands at the moment, so perhaps I can invite the speakers to respond to those issues first.
Yeah, I think, can you hear me? Can I go? I'm not sure if everyone can hear me. Can someone just indicate by raising their hands if they can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I just want to and the more recent. So I did make the point to unions and states and governments tend to, but more recently, and we've seen this happening at the beginning of the pandemic. You will all recall that in the first months of the pandemic, the Minister of Basic Education was saying one thing and the unions were saying another thing. It was only more recently that the collaboration really came together, right? And yes, I didn't refer to much of it, so I do concede that. But the whole point of my presentation was that when we deal with pandemics of this nature, we really have to look beyond just what particular interest groups traditionally focus on. And as one of my colleagues mentioned, there has been a tendency to have a bit of a reactionary focus to the pandemic. And we tend to do this by and large, you know, so we end up being in a constant crisis mode. So the point of my presentation was looking more to the medium to long term and how do we plan for that. And certainly unions have a huge role to play as they have been doing in the more recent period and as they will continue to do, I'm sure, you know, in the work in the months and years going forward. But at the same time, let me just say this, that while there is an argument to be made that in the current conjuncture and in more recent years, teacher unions in South Africa are enjoying a much closer working relationship with the government. It would be a fallacy for us to think that this will always be the case, because teacher unions have a membership that they are accountable to, and from time to time, the economic and industrial concerns and interests of teacher unions take precedence over the broad public interest. We've seen that throughout our own history and in the history of teacher unions and state relations globally. So while I do concede that my input has been predominantly an academic one and maybe not specific to the crisis, you know, we have to think about the larger context going forward. That was the whole point of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Logan. Michael, did you want to respond on the issue of non-digital means of teaching?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, the evidence does show that when the South African public want information, especially information about science and technology or learning, radio is the way to go if you want to reach the marginalized, especially in rural areas. It's free, it's easily accessible, you don't need much equipment, but radio and TV are one-way information streams. So it's absolutely critical to use them where appropriate for one-way information streams. If it's about watching something or listening to something, that's great. But if you need to speak to someone, if you need to have a discussion, if you need interaction, they're not going to help you. So they have a really critical role to play, but it's within those unavoidable parameters.
Thank you. Lindiwe, do you want to add anything to those responses before I move on to further questions?
Not at this point, thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay, other hands up I can see. Jaco, do you want to ask your question, and then Hema as well? Jaco?
Yes, thank you, and thank you to your presenters. Maybe just two remarks and then a question. The first one is the unions played a very, I'm from FETSA, the School Governing Body Association, so we've been working very closely with the unions, specifically regarding the readiness of schools. And one of the failures in the system was that the information that the minister and the provincial heads of departments used to make decisions were clearly the wrong information. So the officials on grassroots level simply didn't have the infrastructure or system to report correctly about what's happening on grassroots level. So if it wasn't for the unions and the governing bodies who drafted their own reports, then the decisions would have been made on wrong presumptions and wrong facts. So, I mean, that's been exposed in this COVID crisis, and that's definitely something that we need to consider going forward. The communication channels were more effective through the unions and through SGBs than through the formal departmental structures, and that's actually shocking. On the technology, the two remarks is, to a certain extent, with the zero-rated websites, industry came forward to really assist some of our schools, or a lot of the schools, with the zero-rated sites. But I think we should not have an online system and a classroom system and a radio system. I think if we can have a blended model and ease some of this into the communities that can really use this, then it can be very cost effective for the department as well. If you just consider the cost of your educators and the cost of books. So if we can make data more readily available, even in deep rural areas where we can use our solar technology, then that can definitely assist. In some deep rural areas, education did take place through technology, even the WhatsApp groups and how they utilized WhatsApps in a very creative way. We must applaud the educators for doing that. But I think lessons learned from COVID, we should definitely not go back to the old way of doing things. Hopefully we can take the best of what we've learned through our communication channels and the use and utilization of technology, how you can optimize that. In a province like Gauteng, that can be a solution for the overcrowding in schools, to enroll 125% learners, where 25% of your learners won't be at school at any given time. So you rotate your learners, so that can be a solution. But thank you for your presentations. I look forward to hear more. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Jaco. And then a question from Hema quickly, and then we'll let the panelists respond. I also see Alistair, you have your hand up as well.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentations from all the presenters. I think, look, I am from NAPTOSA, I'm Basil Manuel's deputy. What I want to suggest, clearly there's gaps in information gaps, and as Jaco has indicated, we've been working actually very closely, and more so, I think the shock to society that all 5 teacher unions are on the same page on issues around learners and teachers. So we've been working from 2015 together with the department when we stopped the common assessments. So I want to suggest, and even with the last presentation in terms of gaps, there's a lot of work being done in the department around Operation Pakisa with getting digital teaching and learning. There's a draft policy. Maybe there should be more collaboration. And somebody did in the chat say, we need to engage and bridge the gap between higher education institutions and ourselves, because we have the chair of the Dean's Forum sitting at some of the forums that we sit at with teacher development. So we need to find a way to narrow that gap. And then thank you again for all the engagement. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Hema. Let me take Alistair's question now, and then we'll give the speakers a chance to respond.
Thank you very much, and let me just thank all 3 of my colleagues for really insightful presentations. I think they're relevant to the moment, and we got a lot out of them. So I just want to pick up on some of the comments made earlier, because I think it's important. What the pandemic has also revealed is what we would call the policy gap, okay? A distinctive difference between the aspects of policy formulation in our country and policy implementation. So for example, the reopening of schools, the first set of dates, and the way in which they were changed. was basically a clear indication that, those who are making decisions around when to open schools were not cognizant of what the realities on the ground were. So my question to the panel would be, how do we engage with this gap, with this disconnect, or with this political ceiling, I would call it, that kind of separates policy formulation from policy implementation? This is an important question for us to think about, because I think any reimagination or reimagining of the education system going forward will have to think about ways in which we can cross that ceiling. That's the first point I want to make. The second point, and very quickly, I liked what Logan said around multiple site intervention, because I think we need to ask the question, how do we share the mantle of responsibility in terms of education? How do we connect to communities in terms of getting other stakeholders more actively involved in supporting our children and young people? And here I want to pick up on the idea of language development, and especially around basic literacy. I've been advocating that we should also think of the concept of what I would call the community educator, or the community education worker, which was based on the concept of the health worker, right? That was sort of put together during the AIDS pandemic, where a number of young people from communities were trained to become frontline workers in caring for the sick and in administering treatment to them. So the concept of developing a cadre of what I would call community education workers who would be trained up to focus on, very specifically, let's say the aspect of language development and basic literacy at primary school level, I think are important debates and conversations that we should be having, that we should kick up into the policy debates of our country. Thank you again for a great session today.
Great, thank you so much. Perhaps, Logan, can I hand over to you first to give a couple of responses before Michael?
Yeah, thanks. Just a very quick one specifically to the point that Alistair was raising about the policy gap, the gap between, policy implementation, policy formulation and policy implementation. I mean, he's quite spot on. I mean, this is quite characteristic of, what happens in the social sectors throughout the country and the world over. And how do you engage with this gap? I think the one way has already been suggested by some of the comments and inputs made by our colleagues from the teacher unions, that we need to sustain the collaborative efforts between all stakeholders, not just unions and government, but grassroots organizations and so on. And we need to support those organizations more, because many of them, especially NGOs, don't have the kind of financial support, the resources to sustain themselves as effectively as the state and teacher unions are able to do. So I think that's quite critical, because when you talk about implementation of policy, it's really about what's happening. It's about the take-up at the grassroots level, at the school level, at the level of the family, in the home. And if we look at both the digital divide and the socioeconomic inequalities that we face in the country, there is no question, there is no argument as to where the bulk of our resources should go to. So, I think that would be quite critical. And then I really like Alistair's suggestion about this whole notion of community education workers, and looking at that and, how we make that a reality. That would be part of, helping to close this gap between policy formulation and implementation. Thanks.
Thanks, Logan. Michael, would you like to respond, and then Lindy?
Yes, I'm just going to respond to some of the comments that have popped up on the chat. One of them was saying it's not only about formal education, it's about the broader personal development of children, and that's in a social context and a family context. And I want to pick up on that because I completely agree, and I think that's critical, the role of parents. So it's not only getting children onto online platforms, it's about engaging with parents so they can facilitate that. And that's also a socio-cultural question about the entire context in which a child finds itself. And that goes into the kinds of questions like normative ones. What kind of social context and development are we looking for, in what direction, and taking into account a whole bunch of historical factors about what you'd want to see there. But I think that the point remains is that we don't want to confine ourselves to the formal education system, although the formal education system is a really critical part of overall education. And another comment was about social media, saying kids are spending all their time on social media. Can't the education system occupy that space? The education system will have to compete really hard to occupy that space. And I think it's something that we can think about. And in a narrower sense, using the social media for education does present opportunities. I think a large proportion of South Africans that don't have much income are on data packages that cost very little, that give them very little access, but they have free WhatsApp. And once you have free WhatsApp, anything that's on social media becomes free and anything else becomes inaccessible. Can the education system get in there? How? But then you have to get the attention of learners and make them prefer your content over the potentially non-educational content they might be choosing. And that's a complicated and challenging social media question, which I think merits a whole lot of further discussion.
Many thanks, Michael. I'm going to also just raise a couple of questions from the chat here and then go to Zenzo, who's also got his hand up. Lindiwe, we have somebody asking about how we in South Africa might get access to sort of assistance and advice from teachers in some of the other countries that you mentioned as international examples of supporting teachers for broader forms of learning and online learning as well. Other ways that we can support teachers and learners in South Africa by drawing on international examples. So how might we get access to some of that assistance is one question. And then another relates to a very good current question, is how are current trainee teachers or teachers studying, students studying to be teachers at university at the moment, is there any additional teaching or support to prepare them by higher education institutions for COVID-19 context in schools in terms of their skills and capacities as soon to be qualified teachers? So there's a couple of questions there. Zenzo, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, no, thank you very much, Heidi. Yes, my name is Zenzo Moyo. I work at MISTRA. Just a quick question. I want to pick from the speakers what their views are on the Department of Basic Education's insistence on saving the school calendar and whatever that means. Whether it is still possible as we stand right now, and what would be the downside of extending the school calendar so that it ends maybe in the middle of next year? Because I would see, like, from the various iterations that we have seen of the different calendars that the Minister of Basic Education has released, all boil down to cutting time, reducing time, and I presume that also leads to the compromisation of the quality that will come out of it. So what would be the downside of extending the school year so that we can take it up to next year, and probably that way we might also cover those who have not been able to access tuition via digital platforms where they don't have those digital platforms. So indeed, if we extend time up to the mid of next year, those people might be covered. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Enzo. Lindiwe, can we go to you first to respond?
Okay, thank you, Heidi. I would like to first respond to the comment which was brought up regarding community education workers. That's a brilliant suggestion. Thank you for that. And what we actually need to do is we will basically be maybe copying from what the Department of Health has been doing. But in education, we can even go further. There are teachers who are waiting training. Our matric students who are waiting to go into teacher education programs, maybe in the following year or something. Because those students qualify, we can actually use them in the communities where they are to assist our grades 3, 4, 5 learners with the language development. We could also use university outreach programs where we have universities, like recently there is some university students who are tutoring some students in matric mathematics. Why can't we do the same for English? What we actually forget is that for them to be able to access matric mathematics and science that we are focusing on, they actually need the language to access them. So if we just address the matric mathematics and science and forget about the language that they need to access those, then maybe we are not actually solving the problem holistically. And then there was a point on what is currently being done for in-service teachers to prepare them for the return of students, maybe in 2021. My opinion, I stand to be corrected. There is no program that I'm aware of at the moment, which is a university program which is preparing student teachers for the following year. Like I said, I stand to be corrected. However, it goes back to what we mentioned earlier to say that we're being reactionary in whatever that we're doing. We want to deal with the problem now, and it would be a good idea to actually prepare, especially those who are living at the end of 2020 or maybe mid of 2021, to deal with this problem because it has affected almost every learner. Therefore, we need to make sure that we prepare for those. Okay. The last question was about the possibility of extending the school year to mid-2021, or maybe even up to the first quarter of 2021. Sure, that can be done, but it needs to be supported by evidence. I know of institutions of higher education which are actually going to end their year in the middle of around March 2021. Surely we can do the same with our primary school learners or even just the ordinary school education system. What there needs to be done is to coordinate whatever is missing of 2020 together with what will be covered in 2021. Because as we extend into 2021, we are also cutting short 2021. We know that we had a disaster in 2020 and we need to overlap into 2021. So what we need is a continuum of 2020 and 2021. And then we see how the curriculum can then be spread across the 2 years, taking into cognizance what we have lost in 2020 and also what needs to be covered in 2021. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lindiwe. Michael, can we go to you for any further responses before Logan?
Yeah, I'm not going to weigh in on the calendar issue. That's not my area of expertise. I'm cognizant that they're almost impossible trade-offs to be had. I don't have further comments on that matter.
Okay, great, thank you. And Logan, would you like to add something here?
Well, not very much, because I think it's been covered by my colleague in earlier inputs. But maybe just on the issue of teacher trainees, one of my short to medium term suggestions in my presentation was, for a very short course, a module on ICT skills training for all teachers, not just pre-service, not those who are about to graduate, but all of those in service, because we can see that online learning is going to be a central part of our education system in the foreseeable future. So we should really try and put together some kind of a quick module to ensure that the majority of our educators, have the necessary skills. And in terms of the school calendar, my sense is that as I said, I agree with my colleague, is that because many of the universities are probably going to extend into February, March, there's going to be some pressure on the schooling system, the Department of Basic Education, to do likewise. And I don't think that's a big tragedy or a big setback. And I think it will certainly give our schools and the education system as a whole time to catch up on some of the lost time, so that we can still try and recover some of the quality that is so badly needed throughout the system. You will also recall, colleagues, that in the past week, the ECD sector, the early childhood development sector, has come out in protest for the lack of support from government and the public at large, to the role that ECD is playing and how they have been neglected. So I really think there is quite a bit of work, even there that we need to focus on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Logan. One of the comments in the chat here is that the possible neglect of early childhood development due to the Department of Education being rather preoccupied with matric results and some of the assessment years. And so it raises the point about investing in the stage when the learner actually enters the system. Another comment just raised about the number of unemployed teachers that we have in the country that can be utilised, and another point about the 2020 matric results actually only being released in February 2021. So obviously the impact that might have on changes to the academic calendar this year. Any further questions? If there's anything I've missed on the group chat, apologies. Feel free to alert me. I'm trying to keep up with all the comments. Any further questions from the floor at all? Hema?
To clarify something, in terms of the ECD, in the President's SONA, he did indicate that DBE will take over ECD. However, that's a long process because it just does not involve ECD, DBE and the Department of Social Development at the moment. There are other entities that are involved. So currently, the Department of Social Development manages the ECD. What's in the what DBE manages is your grade R's and in the RRs, which they ought to have in place by March 2019, and that didn't happen. So I think that we need to understand. People just make an assumption that when we speak ECD, then it's the responsibility. Right now, the only responsibility that is with the DBE around ECD is the curriculum. But in terms of funding, setting them up and managing, it's actually social development. DBE has no jurisdiction. Thank you.
Thanks, Hema, for that correction. Thank you. A further comment here about the non-formal sector, where the notion of co-teaching has been very effectively used, and a question about whether the formal sector can look at something such as co-teaching going forward so that teaching can be in groups where distancing can happen. I don't know if anyone wants to provide any more clarification around that question, or if anybody would like to respond to it. And also, can I just invite any final questions from the floor before we finish? We still have a little bit more time. Then can I ask our speakers if they'd like to respond to anything further, or just make any final concluding remarks?
Yes, Heidi.
Yes, Lindy Way.
I would like to make a final comment on, I think one of the colleagues mentioned that there is a possibility to use teachers who are unemployed, and I totally agree with that. The idea of using students or those who are waiting training or any other additional person should come after we've exhausted the resources. So if that was an assumption that during this period when we need extra teachers, when some teachers are they are booked off sick, some are unwell because of COVID, etc., etc. The assumption is that every teacher who's out there who could be teaching or assisting has taken up some post somewhere. But if there are any that are available, surely they can be able to assist with, because it's basic reading that needs attention, just basic reading. And any experienced teacher will be able to facilitate that. And if we don't have any available, then we can get outside of the circle and find out who else can possibly assist. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindy Way. Just to add to that, is that something that would be particularly useful in terms of the language transition for teachers just to be available to help simply with reading for that transitional language year?
Yes, it would definitely, because our problem is reading. We don't have enough resources and our learners cannot read for meaning. So what we need is somebody who can assist them. Once they're able to read for meaning, it means then the natural sciences and every other subject that they're taking becomes easier for them to understand. And therefore they progress well, performance improves.
Michael, can we go to you?
Yeah, I don't have any specific comments, just to thank the participants here today and the organizers. I think it's been a great discussion. So thanks to everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. And Logan, can I invite you to make any final comments or remarks?
Yeah, just one point. Yesterday I was at a seminar on students' esteem access and success that we hosted at the Untitled Center. And it was a presentation on
Dr. Logan, sorry to interrupt you, but your connection is breaking up.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry, Logan, we're getting a bit of feedback.
Are you getting like some kind of vibration?
Yes, it's quite a lot of vibration and echo on your.
Let me stop my video and see if it helps.
Okay.
Is that any better?
No, there's still quite a lot of echo, and yeah, your voice is a little unclear, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry. It may be connection. What I'll do is I will just type my comment on the chat. Okay.
Perfect. That'd be great. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Thank you. Okay, a last opportunity for any questions or additions while Logan just types his response. Otherwise, I'll hand over to Professor Susan Boyson just to wrap up for us. Prof, if you could just unmute yourself, we can't hear you.
Better. Thank you.
Thank you
very much. All around, 1 minute. Thank you so much for not just the presentations, but all of the participants, both in presence and in your words. Thank you very much. I think our discussion here this afternoon showed very graphically a very unprepared, underprepared at best, but unprepared education system. And there was very early on in this discussion, there was a point that we need to prepare, and prepare because this is not going to be the only outbreak of COVID that we're experiencing, that will be impacting on the education system and its learners harshly, but it's likely that there will also be other epidemics, pandemics, crises, for which we need to be much better prepared. And I think a big strain, an important strain in this discussion, was that contrast between formal and informal, between what the system can do and what informally civil society and community activists can do at this stage. Because also a point mentioned in this debate, we are faced and we realize that we observe it all around us, that big contrast between making policy and putting forward big ideas and getting action, getting implementation. One would almost want to say on the basis of this discussion, there's a need, urgent need, for a big task team to move in and to get ideas and get policies and systems going. But we also know that could take a very long time. So I want to urge here that not only do we advocate, propagate for much faster and more visionary, longer term educational planning, but that we can also be acting as a stimulus for much more community activism, that everybody on the ground, retired teachers, unemployed teachers, learner teachers, any educated, relatively modestly educated community activists, jump in and do what we can to help ameliorate this crisis, because we are amidst it. It's not going to go away. It is going to be with us for a long time. And as a small start point in this, my colleagues at MISTRA, Heidi, Zenzo, Jabulo in the humanity faculty, and others will also be putting together these ideas. I think there's a wealth of ideas that emerge from this discussion. Some new, some old, but just to put them together in one package and start consolidating that, and perhaps find new ways of advocacy. MISTRA will also definitely be taking forward this debate, and in small ways then help also stimulate the search for solutions. I think there are many small seeds that came together in this forum that are very well known, possibly in other forums, unions, parent associations, other interested education NGOs, so many places, in government departments as well. And maybe MISTRA can help serve as a forum to take forward many of these ideas. Even if we're a small overall voice, I hope we'll be a powerful voice, and with your input and participation, I really look forward to seeing what MISTRA and you can help doing going forward. I thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks again for your participation.
Many thanks, Susan, and thank you, everyone. I see Logan has posted a final comment in the chat there if you want to go and refer to that. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time today, and thanks to all our speakers.